What if you could step into a machine, pull a lever, and watch the entire history of humanity blur past you like scenery through a train window? What if you could travel not just through space, but through time itself, forward and backward as freely as walking down a hallway? That idea feels familiar now. We've seen it in blockbuster films, television shows, video games, and novels so countless they fill entire shelves. But here's the thing. Most of what you think you know about time travel, the very concept of it as a journey, as an adventure, as a scientific possibility, can be traced back to one slim, radical, quietly devastating book published in 1895. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells didn't just invent a genre. It asked a question so uncomfortable that most people today still haven't sat with it long enough to feel its full weight. What if the future of humanity isn't progress? What if it's decay? Welcome. Let's travel. To understand the time machine, you first need to understand the world that produced it. The year is 1895. Britain is at the height of the Victorian era, arguably the most confident civilization in human history. Steam engines are rewriting geography, telegraph wires are stitching the globe together. Scientists are unlocking the secrets of electricity, chemistry, and biology. Charles Darwin had already published his theory of evolution 36 years earlier, and the ripples of that idea were still shaking every corner of intellectual life. The popular assumption of the age was that things were getting better, that humanity was on an upward arc, technologically, morally, socially. Progress was almost a religion. Herbert George Wells was not convinced. Wells grew up poor, educated himself furiously, and developed a scientific mind sharpened by doubt. He studied under Thomas Henry Huxley, one of Darwin's greatest champions, and absorbed evolutionary theory not as a comfort, but as a warning. Evolution doesn't promise improvement, it promises change, and change in the wrong environment can mean regression. It can mean extinction. He was 28 years old when The Time Machine was published, and in that book, he aimed that warning directly at the smug confidence of his era. Our story is told through a frame narrative, a literary technique Wells uses brilliantly. The narrator is never named. He is simply the time traveler. We know he lives in Richmond, on the outskirts of London. He's wealthy enough to host dinner parties, educated enough to discuss physics, and eccentric enough that his guests secretly suspect he's a crank. At one such dinner, the time traveler gathers his friends, a journalist, a doctor, a psychologist, a politician, and others, and explains to them with complete seriousness that time is simply the fourth dimension. Space has three dimensions: length, width, and height. Time, he argues, is just another one, and if you can build a machine to move through the first three, there is no reason you cannot build one to move through the fourth. His guests are skeptical, amused, a little condescending. Then he pulls out a small model, tiny levers, ivory, crystal, brass. He sets it on the table, gives it a push, and it vanishes. Not a trick, not an illusion. It has, he tells them, been sent into the future. The guests leave with a mix of bewilderment and polite embarrassment. They assume he has fooled them somehow. The following week, they return for another dinner and find a time traveler in a shocking state. Clothes torn, pale, exhausted, a wild look in his eyes, and a deep cut on his chin. He asks only to wash up and eat before he tells them everything. What follows is his story, told in his own words for the rest of the evening. The time traveler had climbed into his full-size machine, positioned the levers, and pushed. The world around him became a blur. Day and night flickered like a strobe light. He watched his garden grow and change through the seasons. Buildings rose and crumbled. Slowly, then faster. Then with dizzying speed, he hurtled through centuries. He stopped in the year 802,701, 800,000 years into the future. He stepped out into a warm, strange afternoon. The landscape was lush and overgrown, with enormous decaying buildings visible in the distance. The air smelled different, the light looked different, and then the first people appeared. They were small, delicate, beautiful in an almost childlike way, about 4 feet tall, with large dark eyes, curly hair, and soft features. They wore tunics of simple cloth and seemed entirely unbothered by the sudden appearance of a strange man from the distant past. They touched him with gentle, curious hands. They laughed softly. They were utterly without fear, and as it would turn out, utterly without much else. He called them the Eloi. The Eloi lived in enormous, crumbling palaces, once magnificent structures, now sagging, overgrown with ivy and moss, magnificent and ruined the way only very old things can be. They ate fruit. They did no work. They seemed to have no technology, no books, no science, no industry. They spent their days in a hazy, gentle drift, eating, resting, playing, and sleeping together in large communal halls. When the time traveler tried to communicate with them, he found them sweet but frustratingly shallow. Their language was simple. Their attention wandered easily. They had almost no curiosity about him or his machine. A child today might sustain more intellectual engagement than any Eloi he encountered. He initially assumed that this must be the ultimate achievement of civilization, a world so perfected by technology that struggle had been eliminated and humanity had finally arrived at leisure and peace. No war, no disease, no poverty, no labor. Just gentle, beautiful, idle life. But something didn't sit right. The Eloi were afraid of the dark. When the sun set, they gathered inside the halls and huddled together, trembling. They refused to go out after nightfall. No one would explain why. They simply looked frightened and looked away. The time traveler was about to find out. One night, movement in the shadows caught his eye. Pale shapes, long white fingers, large luminous eyes blinking in the darkness. Something watching him near one of the many cylindrical wells that dotted the landscape. He went to investigate the wells. They were ventilation shafts, wide, dark, going straight down into the earth. And from them came a distant sound, the unmistakable sound of machinery. Then he saw them fully for the first time, creatures that had once been human, but shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of underground life. White, almost albino skin, large, colorless eyes adapted to darkness, ape-like posture, hunched and quick. They lived below the surface, working the machines that still somehow produced the clothing and food that Eloi consumed above. He called them the Morlocks, and the horror crystallized quickly. The Morlocks weren't just servants of the Eloi, they were their predators. The Eloi's fear of the dark was not irrational. In the night, when the moon was absent, the Morlocks surfaced, and they took the Eloi, silently, methodically, the way a farmer tends livestock. The relationship between the two species was a grotesque inversion of the Victorian class system. The Eloi were the descendants of the upper class, the idle rich who had grown so comfortable, so dependent on others doing their work, that over hundreds of thousands of years they had lost every capacity for self-preservation. The Morlocks were the descendants of the working class, the poor who had been driven underground, literally, to labor in factories and tunnels, and who, in their darkness, had evolved into something that now fed on the class that had once oppressed them. Wells doesn't let either group off the hook. The Eloi are not sympathetic victims. They are beautiful, passive, and completely helpless, the logical endpoint of comfort without challenge. The Morlocks are not monsters exactly, but the product of exploitation taken to its ultimate conclusion. Both groups have been diminished. Both have lost what makes us human. It is not a hopeful vision. In the river, he saved a drowning Eloi woman from the indifferent gaze of her companions. Her name was Weena, and she became attached to him with a devotion that touched him deeply, though she had almost no ability to communicate anything complex. She gave him flowers. She followed him around. She feared for him in a way the other Eloi didn't seem capable of fearing for anyone. She was the one genuinely emotional thread of the story, a hint that humanity's capacity for affection had survived even this terrible transformation. But she was also a reminder of how much had been lost, because despite her warmth, despite the flowers she pressed into his hands, Weena could not save herself. She could barely understand the danger she was in. When the time traveler needed to retrieve something from the Morlocks, he descended into their tunnels with matches and camphor, light his only weapon. The underworld was viscerally disturbing. The machinery roared. The smell of blood hung in the air. He moved through darkness with pale hands grabbing at him from every direction. He found what he needed and barely escaped. Later, in a desperate night in the forest, he tried to protect Weena and himself from the Morlocks by building a fire. The fire spread out of control. In the chaos and smoke and screaming, he escaped, but Weena did not. He never found her. It is one of the quiet devastations of the book, a small loss in a story full of enormous ones. Throughout his time in the future, there had been one looming landmark, a large white sphinx on a pedestal, its face worn smooth by centuries. Near it was a locked bronze door. Inside that door, the Morlocks had hidden his time machine. This was not an accident. The Morlocks were curious, more curious perhaps than the Eloi. They had examined his machine in the dark, trying to understand it. He managed to pry open the bronze door and climb inside, only to realize too late that the Morlocks had set a trap. They were waiting for him in the darkness. As they grabbed at him, he found the machine by touch, pulled the levers, and shot forward through time. Shaken and desperate, he traveled even further into the future, millions of years ahead, to see what ultimately became of the Earth. What he found in the far future was perhaps the most haunting sequence in all of Victorian literature. The sun had grown enormous and red, barely moving in the sky. The rotation of the Earth had slowed almost to a stop. The shore of what had once been the ocean stretched before him, cold and silent. The air was thin. The temperature was near freezing. And there was life, but barely. Strange, crab-like creatures moved in the dimness. A black object, perhaps a kilometer long, flopped weakly on the beach. The sky was dark, except for the enormous dying sun. He traveled a little further, 30 million years from his own time. The sun was even larger. The cold was absolute. The beach was utterly still. A green slime clung to rocks at the shoreline. Nothing else moved. He had watched the death of life on Earth, not with a bang, but with a slow, cold, exhausted silence. He pulled the lever and came home. The time machine is 130 years old, and in some ways, it has never felt more urgent. Wells wrote it as a warning about class, about what happens when society divides itself so completely between those who benefit from comfort and those who produce it, that the two groups eventually become unable to recognize each other as the same species. He was writing about 1895 Britain, but he could just as easily have been writing about the world of today. Think about the language we already use. We talk about the elite and the working class as if they inhabit different realities, because increasingly they do. Gated communities versus industrial zones, remote executives versus essential workers, the children who summer in the south of France and the children who don't have access to clean water. These divides are not natural, they are constructed. And Wells' nightmare scenario suggests that if you take a constructed divide and let it run for long enough, it becomes a biological one. The Eloi and the Morlocks are not cartoons. They are a thought experiment taken to its logical extreme, and the logic is uncomfortably sound. There is also something deeply relevant in Wells's treatment of progress. We live in an era of extraordinary technological acceleration. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, genetic engineering, automation. These are not small changes, they are civilizational shifts. And most of us tend to assume, the way Victorians assumed, that change means improvement, that the arc of history bends towards something better. Wells refuses that assumption. He understood Darwin, and what Darwin showed us is that species don't evolve toward goodness or wisdom or sophistication. They evolve toward fitness in a particular environment. Change the environment and fitness changes with it. If the environment that humans create removes the need for courage, intellectual curiosity, physical capability, and genuine empathy, then over enough time, those traits will fade. Not because of malice, because of comfort. The time traveler's horror is not at monsters, it is at the recognition that the monsters used to be human, that they became what they became through entirely natural, understandable, even logical processes. That is a far more disturbing thought than any alien invasion or supernatural threat. And finally, there is that ending, that image of a dying Earth, cold and quiet, under an enormous red sun. It is profoundly humbling. Everything humanity has ever built, every civilization, every work of art, every philosophy, every act of love, will eventually be covered in silence. This is not nihilism. Wells isn't saying that nothing matters. He's saying that the window we have is finite, which should make how we use it matter more, not less. The Time Machine is a short book. You could read it in an afternoon, but the questions it leaves you with will take considerably longer to shake off. What are we building exactly? And for whom? Are we building a world that keeps human beings genuinely alive, curious, capable, challenged, connected? Or are we building a world of golden ease that slowly hollows us out? H.G. Wells was not a pessimist, exactly. He believed in the power of the human mind to recognize a problem before it became irreversible. The fact that he wrote this book at all is a kind of hope. The hope that if we can see clearly enough, we can choose differently. But first, we have to be willing to look. The lever is in your hands. Where do you go from here?